Hello and welcome to a Learn at DLF tutorial. This tutorial is called DIY Map Digitization and Access. My name is Andy Rutkowski, and I am currently a visualization specialist at the University of Southern California Libraries. And I'll be co-presenting along with Jack Tieszen, a recent graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles's MLIS program. This presentation will walk through a digitization project with the aim of sharing workflows, tools, and methods, all within a DIY framework and ethos. At the outset, I want to say that neither of your presenters are digitization experts. The goal of this project was to provide access to materials that had been sitting on shelves for years collecting dust. This project would be worked on with little to no IT support, funding, or specialized hardware and software. That is not to say that we didn't have access to some really good infrastructure. It is to say, though, that we improvised and worked with what we had at hand. Before we go any further, I want to share our project in its current state. You can use the bit.ly link here provided, bit.ly/LAPLANDOCS, to access the site. And so here's the website. It is fairly simple. There's an interactive map web viewer here with two of the documents, the maps loaded in. You can see here one is from South Central, one is from Boyle Heights. You can zoom in and get really close in, get great detail. When you zoom back out, you can click on the markers that are in the middle of these maps. And these bring up the actual documents. And so with this document viewer side, you can click on an image. You can walk through the entire PDF on the site, or you can just download the entire PDF and have it for yourself. And so this is it. This is a really, we tried to make this as simple, as intuitive as possible, and with the end goal of providing access to the maps into the documents. So let's talk about why DIY briefly. Some of the most important aspects of working through this project was how it encouraged creativity and experimentation. It also allowed for developing a richer set of skills by promoting a model of learning by doing that expected iteration and direct hands-on experience. Broader skills and workflows were learned because they in effect had to be as part of the process. There was also an emphasis on working with what we had. Because of that, a self-sufficiency and autonomy was possible, and though there were obvious limitations that restrained some of the work, ultimately solutions were found. One of the highlights of working within this DIY framework, though, was being present with this project and not delaying or waiting for things when blockages occurred. Rather than wait, a workaround was found and development continued. And most importantly, the end goal of sharing the materials in a creative and accessible way was realized. I also want to take a moment here to say a few words of how this work did happen. Jack and I first met in December of 2019. Jack reached out to me to discuss GIS and map and visualization librarianship, and after our conversation, we talked further about the possibility of doing some type of internship. I didn't have any funding, and so I proposed an internship model in which he identified skills that he might want to learn along with a tangible project that could be part of his resume and portfolio at the end. So as a result, our internship was guided by what Jack wanted to get out of it, and I had no set job or tasks for him to complete. The first month or so of the internship was assessing and proposing and learning more about this collection of documents. Another month was spent scanning, georeferencing, thinking about workflows, project development. And then another month was really spent on transitioning these materials into an online platform. And all the while, I want to point out that there was, obviously a national emergency. We're still in this pandemic, and this happened, really right in the middle of doing this work. And we're still able to continue to do it, and also, look to and find venues to sort of help promote it, such as DLF, so we can kind of share this process out. Now I really want to give a really brief overview of the actual documents. They're Los Angeles planning documents from 1991, a pivotal year in Los Angeles. The following year, 1992, you have the Los Angeles uprising. There's over 30 neighborhoods represented in these documents. There's rich narrative descriptions describing the neighborhoods. There are these colorful maps that also show services, other infrastructure. And in part, these maps were really a source of inspiration for wanting to put these out there in a digital environment. And so here is our equipment, a fairly boring run-of-the-mill copier that hopefully you can find in an office or library, and then a 2014 MacBook Pro. And really, we're just sort of sharing this to say that this is what we had at hand. I think you could probably find, similar infrastructure wherever you are. And if not, you really just, emphasizing that you don't need, top of the line equipment to sort of do this. You just need to want to digitize and put materials online. And with that, I'm going to now give it over to Jack to kind of walk you through the rest of the work that he did.
All right, thank you. So hello, as Andy stated before, my name is Jack Tieszen, and I'm a recent graduate of UCLA's MLIS program and the intern who assisted in the development of this project. So I'm mainly going to talk about the digital side of things, the applications and systems that we used and how specifically we used them for this project. So the main applications and systems that we used were Google Drive to help store and share our data in digitized files, QGIS for visualizing spatial data, Mapbox for hosting a map, and GitHub for digital publishing. And we'll get into the specifics of those later on in this presentation. We also used for preliminary tasks, we used Automator to convert multiple files, and we used Photoshop to edit images in order to remove unnecessary elements of the digital files. And if you don't have access to Photoshop or don't want to spend money on Photoshop, you can use the program GIMP, which is free to use and does very similar things. So the project, as stated before, was a series of planning documents from the early 1990s related to the city of Los Angeles. And we knew that we wanted to get these digitized and published, but beyond that, we had no set plan. So much of the time early on in this internship was spent in developing a system to work with the various elements of this project. This open-ended aspect allowed for the development and skills ranging from practical GIS work to metadata creation to workshop development and event presentation. It also led to many variant methods of publishing digitized materials, so keep that in mind. There are many ways of being able to accomplish what we accomplished, and exploring these avenues leads to more discoveries in the process, which is really exciting. So getting started on this project required a few preliminary efforts before addressing the main areas of QGIS, Mapbox, and GitHub. Digitization projects can be very different, as explained before, so these efforts are just what personally affected us and what we dealt with in the development of this project. So if you're trying to accomplish something similar with maps, I would suggest looking into these things as well before diving straight into QGIS work. So digitization, for this portion, we use the highest resolution setting that we had access to, which in our case was 600 dots per inch or DPI. This gave us a digitized image that was clear and also one that could be zoomed in upon without losing any details, which we viewed as important for maps. This was a very easy part of the project, and it's likely that we went overboard with the resolution. So realistically, you can use whatever you have access to. If that is a high-end scanner, then great. But if all you have access to is a smartphone to take a photo and convert that into a PDF, then that's fine as well if your end goal is just to get stuff digitized. So photo conversion is sometimes necessary depending on what your files are after they've been digitized. In our case, our scanner gave us PDF files, which do not work in QGIS. So we had to convert them into TIFF files, which you can do with Automator on Mac without losing any resolution. And lastly, photo manipulation, it just means removing elements of the photo that you do not want to show up in the final product. In our case, we had hole punch marks, we had thick borders, and we had a lot of white space that we just didn't view as important for our digital maps. And so we used Photoshop to quickly erase these elements. So to recap the three things that we did, digitization, photo conversion, and photo manipulation, these all took a very small amount of time and were fairly easy to accomplish. But we put them in here because they're important things to think about in your own digitization program early on so that you don't waste time going back multiple steps to ensure that your files work or that they look good for your own project. And wasting time isn't particularly great when you're on a set schedule. But the bulk of the project and where you should be spending most of your time comes through working with QGIS, Mapbox, and GitHub. And so with that, let's talk about them. What exactly is QGIS? It stands for Quantum Geographic Information System, and it is an open source or free software used for visualizing spatial data. And in our project, we used it for two very important purposes. The first was to georeference our maps. And georeferencing is the process of assigning real-world coordinates to each pixel of the raster image. Or essentially, it's the process of stitching together two images, your base map and your digitized image, until they correspond to each other spatially. The second purpose was to merge our layers. The problem that we came to early on in the project was that the physical maps that we had were far too large to scan as one file. And so we had to take the pieces of the physical map and both scan them separately and georeference them separately. And so when we finished this process, we had to combine the maps all together within QGIS through merging, and it made the map whole again so that we had a single file that we were able to take and transition to the next part of the program. And the value of this just concerns organization. It's far easier to deal with one modified TIFF file than 10 or 12 that correspond to each other, especially once you get into the area of Mapbox in this project. So what exactly is Mapbox? It's an open source mapping platform for custom designed maps. It is a free to use website that does have features that you can pay for, but in our case, we just used the baseline tier, which was free to use. And how we used Mapbox in our project was as a base server for our published maps. This was incredibly helpful because Mapbox completes a task that would otherwise have taken a significant amount of time, that being the task of creating a server for your maps or finding a server within your institution that you're working with. Mapbox helped us to overcome this hurdle of lacking infrastructure, and for that, it is extremely helpful beyond it just being free to use. We also used it as a way to combine projects. As you can see here, South Central Los Angeles and Boyle Heights are currently the two maps that we have within the single Mapbox server. And these projects were done at different times, and they were also added to Mapbox at different times. So if you have a large scale project or know that your digitization program will have many parts to it, then Mapbox is a good way to continually edit and add on stuff as it gets digitized and georeferenced. And lastly, GitHub. It's a website that provides hosting for software development and version control using Git. It is a massive website that has a lot of repositories of web templates. And for our project specifically, we used GitHub as a tool to find a repository and utilize already created web templates to host our maps. We used a repository called Flaneur, which gave us the exact template that we were looking for to display not only our maps, but also our text and images that came from the planning documents themselves. Flaneur as a repository was made initially to help students create essays that could be featured in a digital map edition, but we essentially ignored its original purpose and reappropriated it for our own digitized project. And this further emphasizes both the manipulation and scale of GitHub, but also the DIY aspect of this type of project. And so to conclude, I just want to talk a little bit about the transition state between workers and the importance of documentation. Throughout this internship, one of the things that I found to be incredibly helpful when I was exploring the various avenues of QGIS, Mapbox, and GitHub was writing down what I was doing in a way that was detailed enough for someone with no prior experience to read and then pick up my work from where I stopped it. This further developed into workshops and other teaching tools that can be used in the future. So the value of documentation, especially with a multi-step process like this, is really important. And thank you very much for joining us at this Learn at DLF tutorial. On this page, there are the links to the resources that we discussed within this talk, as well as our contact information. We would love for you to reach out and contact us if you have any questions about the project. Thank you for listening.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Take care.